So let's talk about what it means for the preference relation to be rational. We have two axioms of rationality, completeness and transitivity. So completeness, what we're saying here is that the consumer is able to evaluate all alternatives. The consumer has the necessary knowledge to have formed a preference relation regarding all possible alternatives in the commodity space. So for all x and y available, we have to have either x is at least as good as y, or y is at least as good as x, or both, in which case we really have indifference. We are indifferent between x and y. And that's because of how we have defined the indifference relation. Now you'll note here that if we only have x at least as good as y, but we don't have both, so we don't have y at least as good as x, then what we really have here is a strict preference relation. So we really have x strictly preferred to y, and the same is true here. If we have x is at least as y is at least as good as x, but not x at least as good as y, then we really have y is preferred to x. So this is quite a strong assumption. You'll note in the textbook Mascalel, Winston, and Green on page 6, the strength of the completeness assumption should not be underestimated. I'm reading from the textbook here. Introspection quickly reveals how hard it is to evaluate alternatives that are far from the realm of common experience. It takes work and serious reflection to find out one's own preferences. And so what we're assuming here is that this work has already taken place. Transitivity now. Transitivity, what we're saying is that the consumer is capable of comparing two alternatives at a time. The consumer is making pairwise comparisons, but these comparisons have to be linked in a certain way, such that the consumer's choice be consistent. So if we have three alternatives, three element x, y, and z in the commodity space, and if we have x at least as good as y, and y at least as good as z, then the transitivity requirement imposes that x be at least as good as z. So we are ruling out the case of z being preferred to x. And the reason for this is we're trying to avoid cycles. If we had z strictly preferred to x, then if you were to offer the consumer x, the consumer would pick z, but then because y is at least as good as z, the consumer might be picking y, and because x is at least as good as y, then the consumer might be picking x. But then you have a cycle because the consumer would then switch to z. So in order to avoid this type of a cycle and allow the consumer to settle the choice, we impose transitivity. Again, quite a strong requirement. You might be interested to read page 7. Different examples as to why the transitivity requirement might be violated as an empirical matter. You have the issue of just perceptible differences. You have framing issues. The manner in which the alternatives are presented to the consumer does matter. And you have the issue of change in taste and sudden reversal of preferences, addictive behavior, etc. So you might be interested to read about those different possible violations.